This conference will now be recorded.
So welcome everybody to our webinar today. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Shona Glenn of the Scottish Land Commission, and I'll properly introduce her in a wee minute. Before we get started, I'll just tell you about next week's webinar. So we're going to have one on the 8th of October, and that will be given by JP of ERF, and it's going to be on in situ remediation. As you know, if you've been to the webinars before, we always ask our speakers if they would like to nominate a charity, and I will put the details of Shona's charity in the chat box in a minute behind me posted. And if you're able to give any sort of donation to that, that would be gratefully received. So without further ado, I will apologise again to Shona for the mix-up with getting everybody online today. Thank her for her patience. Shona is the Head of Policy and Research at the Scottish Land Commission. She's an economist with 15 years experience in economic development, spanning both the public and the private sector. She's passionate about transforming our economy by putting land back into the economic model, and she's going to be speaking to us today about the recommendations which are hot off the press of the Vacant and Derelict Land Task Force. So I'll just hand over to you if you want to share the screen, Shona.
Bear with me while I work out how to do this. We've tested it, so it should be fine.
Yeah.
Now, can you see that?
That's good. You're good to go.
Excellent, good. Okay, and hello everybody, great to see, well, it would be great to see so many faces, great to see so many names. I'm Shona, I head up the policy and research team in the Land Commission, and I've been working intensively with the task force over the last couple of years, so really pleased to be here today. We've published recommendations today, so it's been a busy day for us today, and you can probably see my prop in the background here. Alice and I had the joy of recording one of these cringeworthy videos for comms yesterday, so I thought I'd make use of the prop. In terms of what I'm planning to cover today, I thought I might say a few words about the Land Commission to start with. I'll explain, I think, why we decided to focus on vacant and derelict land, why we think it's important. I'll give you some background to the task force and particularly focus on the work that we did to gather an evidence base for the recommendations. Then I'll talk you through, I'll give you a summary of what's in the recommendations, and then I think I'll round off by explaining or with some suggestions about what you might be able to do. So, in terms of who we are, the Land Commission is a very small non-departmental public body established in 2017 as a result of the Land Reform Act 2016. We have 16 staff, we're based up in Inverness, and we have 6 commissioners, including 1 tenant farming commissioner. In terms of what we do, we have a very broad remit actually. When we were set up, we were given the remit to look at any area of legislation or policy relating to land. And if anybody can tell me anything that isn't covered by that, I'd be really interested to know. And it's a bit of a double-edged sword. It's fantastic because it means that we've got a really broad scope to kind of do almost what we like. But it does it can make it difficult to work out where we should focus. So it's fantastic to have such freedom. We've got an important role to play in supporting, providing advice to the government on policy and legislation. We also have an important role in terms of supporting the implementation of the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. Some of you may be aware of the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. It was published in 2017 by the government. It's the first of its kind in the world, and I think the government is quite rightly proud of it. It does exactly what it says in the tin. It sets out what everybody's rights and responsibilities are in Scotland in relation to land, and it's got 6 principles. Setting out what the expectations are, and part of our role is to interpret those principles for different sectors. We also, as I say, we have this specific role to support the Tenant Farming Commissioner, who has a specific role set out in legislation. In terms of what we're trying to achieve, that's a page there from our latest strategic plan, which was also published this week. It's been quite a busy week for us this week. Our vision is to achieve a fair, inclusive and productive system of ownership, management and use of land that delivers greater benefit for all of the people of Scotland. it's fantastic to be able to work on this just now, because I think it's certainly obvious to me, I think increasingly obvious to a lot of people, that how we use and manage land is going to be really fundamental to tackling two of society's biggest challenges, climate change and inequality. And of course, both so crucial for delivering the fair and green recovery that we keep hearing about. One thing to just to make it explicit, a lot of people think land reform is all about rural Scotland. It isn't. It absolutely isn't. I can't emphasise that enough. Land reform is just as much about urban Scotland as it is about rural Scotland. So that's who we are. Why did we decide vacant and derelict land was something that we wanted to focus on? Well, really two reasons for this. One, because of the harm it causes, and two, because of the missed opportunity it represents. And in terms of the harm it causes, I think the reasons for that are probably obvious. I think what you see when you get up in the morning or when you go home at night affects everything. It affects how you feel about yourself, how you feel about where you live, whether you're happy to let your kids out to play, even whether you can be bothered getting up and going out to work in the morning. So, it really is so important to people's lives and people's well-being. And there's very strong evidence to support this. Work on health inequalities between Scotland and the rest of the UK, done a couple of years ago, identified unexplained mortality in Scotland of 5,000 people a year. So that's 5,000 people a year who die early, whose deaths cannot be explained by sort of existing patterns of deprivation and social conditions. One of the factors that's been identified for that is what has been described by the researchers as an adverse physical environment. So vacant and derelict land is literally killing people. It's something we have to tackle. And as with so many of these things, deprived communities are affected the most. A third of people in Scotland or nearly a third, live within 500 metres of a derelict site, but that goes up to about 55% in the most deprived communities. So we have to tackle this. But the positive side of this is it's about the missed opportunity that these sites represent. These sites could be so much more than they are at the moment. They could be helping us to, sorry about that. Try to look at two screens at once here. They could be helping us we could be using them to grow food, to generate electricity, provide places for kids to play, build homes and places to relax, and outdoor classrooms, very topical at the moment. It literally touches on virtually every major area of public policy. And we need to start seeing these sites as opportunities rather than just problems. If we're going to change this attitude, we just need to start seeing these sites as opportunities rather than problems. So to help us do that, we published another bit of work a couple of months ago to try and help with this. And it was a very simple bit of work, just some case studies highlighting a number of parts of Scotland where really challenging sites have been brought back into use in ways that support wider wellbeing objectives. So just to give you a couple of examples, the Shettleston Growing project is the first one I picked on. Previously owned by a housing association, it had been derelict for years. You can see the before and after pictures there. Local residents decided to get together, form a committee to look at ways of incorporating it into everyday living. And the Shettleston Growing project was born. It uses raised beds, which are ideal for sites where ground contamination might be an issue. And it's an opportunity for local people to grow their own food. They also provide training on how to cook it, social interactions with users, and the health and wellbeing benefits of that are all really obvious, I think. Next example I was going to highlight was the Wishaw Hill Wood Pump Track, and I can't say that, doesn't matter how many times I try. North Lanarkshire example this time, and one of my favourites. I think it's a great story. Former derelict site transformed into this fantastic bicycle skate park, and all sorts of benefits in terms of reducing antisocial behaviour, increasing physical activity, all of that kind of thing. So this is the kind of thing that we're talking about. This is what we want to change. Some of this stuff is already happening, but we need to normalise it. We need more of it. And the way we're going to do this is by transforming the policy environment to make that kind of project easier to deliver. So we can move to a situation where it's no longer normal for large chunks of urban Scotland simply to be abandoned. So how did we set out to do that? Well, as you know, we set up a task force a couple of years ago with the aim of tackling transforming Scotland's approach to vacant and derelict land. We didn't set out to fix derelict land all by ourselves. We're not big enough to do that. We set out to transform the policy environment to make it easier to bring sites back into use, to make it easier for people like you guys to do what you're good at. But we also wanted to make sure, just to reshape the policy environment to stop this from happening again. We brought together a whole range of people from right across the public, private and third sectors, put them in a room together and asked them to think about what needed to change to make this a reality. We took a very methodical approach to doing this. We started by looking at the problem, and because we wanted to make sure we did understand it properly before moving on to delivery. And I think there were people at the time who maybe found that a wee bit frustrating and were keen for us to jump immediately into pilot projects. But I'm actually really glad we didn't do that now, because what often happens, I think, in the public sector, when the public sector decides to do something about regeneration, is some really big and very, very good shiny new projects are done, but not many lessons are learned. And then we all kind of spend the next 20 years scratching our head wondering, why we can't do more of that kind of project. So we wanted to avoid that and make sure that we're actually treating the cause rather than the symptom. So, the policy environment rather than just the sites. And given what's happening just now with COVID and all that's been said about the risk of a new legacy of dereliction emerging, I'm really very glad that we did that. Because I think you don't have to spend long looking at the register to realise that a lot of the really persistent sites on there are a legacy of a poor public policy response to previous structural changes in the economy. So in terms of the evidence base, we did quite a lot of research actually to support the work of the task force. The first bit of work we did, we commissioned Ryden to help us understand the problem a bit better. We asked them to do a scoping study to look at what's on the register, the vacant and derelict land register, and to look at a detailed sample, a representative sample of about 60 sites to help us understand better what was going on. And we did that work because in the beginning, the message we were getting from a lot of people is that simply the problem's too big. You'll never manage it. There's not enough time or money. And the findings of that first bit of work were quite encouraging. First of all, the problem might not be as big as we think. There's a lot of sites on the register that shouldn't be there and that will come forward either as a result of normal market mechanisms or that are already well on the way to being naturalised. So actually what we're looking at here is a hard core of persistently derelict sites that really do need public intervention, but there's not nearly as many of them as is on the register. So that's the good news. I suppose bad news is there's still too many to tackle one by one. We do need a thematic approach in which different types of sites are kind of bundled together and we come up with solutions that can be scaled to different sites with similar challenges. And I think the final main message from that bit of work was simply the one that there's just not enough market demand for all of Scotland's derelict sites to get a profitable development. Many of them are in difficult market areas with low market demand, and addressing them is going to mean difficult choices for landowners, and probably landowners taking less money than they might ideally like. So that was the first bit of work. The next bit of work we did was looking at this issue of funding, and another common issue that we were getting faced with in the early days was people saying there's just not enough money to do this, and that's true. There's never enough money. But we did notice that people seem to be particularly focused on the Vacant and Derelict Land Fund. It's focused on 5 local authorities and there's never enough. And a sort of feeling that if you're not one of those authorities, then there's nothing you can do. And I can't emphasise enough that's not true. There's never going to be enough money, of course there's not, but there might be more than you think. But I think we just need to be perhaps a little bit more imaginative sometimes in what we're looking at, because if we're focused on just fixing dereliction or contamination, actually we might be missing wider opportunities to address wider public policy and objectives, so health, well-being, environment, crime and justice, you name it. If we can start thinking like that, I think, and really sort of leveraging the funding that's available for those policy priorities, I think you start to see there's actually probably a lot more money available than it might at first seem. So what we did with that work is actually we produced what I think is hopefully quite a helpful summary of some of the funding information that's out there, and that is available on our website. The next bit of work we did Another issue that emerged pretty early on was this feeling that previous regeneration efforts haven't always or necessarily focused on those sites that really matter to people. So we commissioned another bit of work to investigate the factors that determine how harmful a site is to a community, and we identified a number of important factors. First of all, around about the impact of a site being often disproportionate to its size. So small sites can have a very big impact. There's an issue about proximity, how close a site is to people. Is it a town centre site, or is it off in the countryside where not many people see it? And how sites are officially designated, it doesn't necessarily reflect their value to the community. Sometimes what's perceived as harmful by a community isn't necessarily recognised as problematic on the Vacant Derelict Land Register, and vice versa. Sometimes sites that are classed as derelict actually can be highly valued by the community. So what we did with that bit of work was we turned it into a tool that can be used to help communities and local authorities work through which and prioritise which might be the most harmful sites. The next bit of work we did was picking up on this issue of the persistent of legacy of derelict sites that I was talking about earlier. We did some more investigations to try and identify those hardcore persistent sites that we'd identified in phase 1. So it's the permanent residents of the register that just aren't going to move without public intervention. So to do that, we applied a number of filters to the register, and we looked at derelict sites on the basis that they are the most likely to be the most challenging and where public intervention is most needed. We looked at urban sites on the basis that they're more proximate to people and likely to be more harmful. And we looked at sites that have been unused since 2000 or earlier, on the basis that they have been derelict since before the financial crash, so are likely to be genuinely stuck. And what we were doing with this piece of work was trying to find a reasonably robust and objective way of identifying a set of national priorities. Now, we know it's not perfect, but we do think it's a significant improvement on what we've had up until now. So those are the dusties. One of the things that we've published today is a map of the dusties. Actually, it's online. It's on our website. Do have a look. And it's very obvious from that map that the dusties share a number of characteristics. They're heavily concentrated in Glasgow in the west. There's a particular prevalence in deprived communities, and many of them are in complex or private ownership. So, and we are looking for case studies, by the way. And so if you do have a look at the map and are aware of something exciting going on any of these sites, please do let us know. Finally, the final bit of the jigsaw in terms of the evidence base was a bit of work that we did with Bigger Economics. And we did this work because we were aware that how the public sector makes decisions about what to spend money on has a big impact. At the moment, these decisions are often made based on the basis of a fairly narrow cost-benefit analysis, financial returns to the landowner, and usually financial returns to the landowner are usually the most important consideration. And when the numbers don't stack up, nothing happens. And that's okay if you're a profit-driven firm, but not for the public sector. And the public sector actually can be quite guilty of this. Unless a site is part of a regeneration initiative, then wider well-being benefits of bringing it back into use often aren't part of the equation. And when sites are part of a programme of disposals to fund core activity, financial considerations often trump everything else. So by building on greenfield sites, if it's cheaper to meet departmental obligations by building on a greenfield site, then that's sometimes what happens. And you can see that in relation to public expenditure on everything from housing to hospitals, and it's a big part of the reason we've got such a legacy of derelict sites. So we need to change the basis of decision making. And that's why one of the things we did was develop this sort of new approach to financial appraisal, in which well-being is prioritised over financial returns. It gives us a new way of appraising public investment that takes account of the wider benefits of bringing sites back into use. And what we need to do now is make sure that that's being adopted right across the public sector. So there's two outputs from that work. First of all was what we call a case for change report, which sets out why we need to do this. And the second thing was actually practical guidance, showing people how we can do this. And again, both of those are on our website. So that's the evidence base. What we then did, sort of end of last year, beginning of this year, we used the initial research to identify a number of key strategic priorities, and you can see those on the slide there, hopefully, which we published in a statement of intent, I think, around about July last year, I think. We then developed those strategic priorities into a set of specific recommendations. We did a lot of consultation around this. So we involved about 40 stakeholders, different groups, including about 20 local authorities. So some of you might have been involved in that. And if you haven't, it's highly probable that at least one of your colleagues will have been. In terms of the recommendations themselves, the 13 main recommendations, and each of those recommendations is actually a bit of an amalgamation of a number of sort of smaller sub-recommendations. First of all, we need to reform the register. We need to reform the Vacant and Derelict Land Register. We're lucky to have it, but it's not nearly as useful as it could be. And actually, it's become really, if I'm honest, a bit of a statistical exercise. It needs to be part of the planning process rather than just a tool for allocating funding or statistical exercise, and to give us a much clearer focus on stuck sites that really do need public intervention. And we need to keep it up to date. With the Vacant and Derelict Land Fund only going to 5 local authorities, there's not much of an incentive for the others to update it regularly. We think that needs to change, and we do think there's a need for the fund to be more widely available to other local authorities. We also need to make the information, or make the sites on the register much more visible. At the moment, the register, it's an Excel-based register that's kind of lurks away in an obscure corner of the Scottish Government website. And people can't do anything about a site if they don't know where it is. So we need a publicly available map-based resource that's specifically designed to attract investment. It's not just providing information for information's sake. We also, in terms of general principles, we need to start applying a circular economy principles to land reuse and putting well-being at the centre of decision making. Scotland's got some really ambitious targets actually in relation to recycling, for example, but it's a mystery to me why we don't apply similar principles to land. Why is it still acceptable for land to be abandoned when it's no longer needed? You wouldn't do that with a plastic bag, so why are we doing it with land? What am I on? Fourth recommendation. Third recommendation. We need to update and reform our regeneration strategy and enhance its status within the policy hierarchy. We need to make sure that the place principle is fully embedded right across all layers of government, because it's going to be so fundamental to recovery. The regeneration strategy is great, but it hasn't been updated since 2011, and that means it doesn't reflect a lot of the important work that's been done on community empowerment and community ownership, community wealth building, or of course the Planning Act. So we need to change. We need to update it, and we need to bring it up in the policy hierarchy. The next thing we need to do, we need the public sector to take a much more proactive approach to initiating and driving forward development. We think the Scottish planning policy needs to be reformed to incorporate a stronger focus on place-based regeneration. And we think long-term sites should be identified as national investment priorities in the National Planning Framework. And we think that the remediation of brownfield sites should be recognised as an infrastructure investment priority in the next infrastructure investment plan. And recommendation 5, we need to make it easier to overcome ownership barriers to land reuse. We need to introduce new legislation for compulsory sales orders and undertake a proper review of existing land assembly mechanisms and reform the current approach to public sector land disposals. The next, not a lot of slides. So the next thing we need to do is all about making sure that major sources of funding are aligned to support delivery, and I'm not just talking about regeneration funding here. Vacant and derelict land has the potential to realise a whole range of policy objectives, housing, public health, crime, environment, the whole shebang. And we need to leverage that to help us bring these sites back into use. The Vacant and Derelict Land Fund is going to be really important, and we do think it should be increased, but we think the criteria need to be reviewed to make sure it's working as well as it needs to be. At the moment, there's these perverse incentives that the councils with the most vacant and derelict land on the register are those that get funding. So where's the incentive to remove sites from the register? And of course, we also think that the focus for funding should be on those sites that are most harmful, not necessarily on geographic location. We've also recommended, recommendation 7, we've recommended the Scottish Government should initiate a review of strategic funding streams and make sure that they're all aligned around the place principle and incorporate criteria that are really going to help direct investment to parts of the country that need it most. And to do that, as I've said already, I think we need new approaches for praising investment and that need to be adopted right across the public sector that go beyond financial measures and provide a much clearer focus on well-being. Recommendation 8 is we need new approaches to funding the remediation of vacant and derelict land. Firstly, we think we need a new compensation instrument that would enable unavoidable biodiversity loss from greenfield development to be offset by improvements to derelict sites elsewhere. Now, whether that's biodiversity net gain or some kind of tax, we've not specified, but we think something's needed in that area. We've also proposed a new fund that would enable derelict sites to be remediated in order to create a publicly owned development land bank, for future housing and such like. And we've also proposed that a new community fund should be created to help tackle harmful and persistent small sites. So, in terms of what we do to change the culture, stop the flow of new sites coming onto the register, because this is really, really important. One of the issues we're facing here is that we're constantly working, as you all know, we're working against this huge backlog that's been added to all the time. And it's like, a bath with the taps running, you can't empty it doesn't matter if you've pulled out the plug, the bath's not going to empty unless you turn off the tap. And I think the risk of COVID has really exacerbated this. So I think to do that, to achieve that culture change, we need to embed a new culture of responsible land ownership right across Scotland, public sector and private sector, so that when land and buildings are no longer required, they're just not abandoned. They're not abandoned, allowed to fall into dereliction. And we need to embed that principle right across the public and private sector within public corporate social responsibility objectives. We think public funding should be contingent on recipients fulfilling their obligations as responsible landowners, and we think that the disposal of public land and property should only take place after due diligence has been taken place to ensure prompt and productive reuse. We've suggested that all landowners should be expected to adopt proactive estate management policies that enable assets at risk of obsolescence to be identified early, and plans to be put in place to avoid assets from falling into disuse. And we've also asked the government to move quickly to identify options for using the tax system to repurpose surplus commercial property for socially beneficial uses. And finally, and I think this is the one I find particularly exciting, we've asked the government to create a national programme of investment in green infrastructure and to do that in a way that supports job creation and skills development. We've suggested the programme should be built around 4 pillars of action: urban green spaces, community-led regeneration, low carbon development, and renewable energy. And the final thing that we've asked the government to do is to appoint somebody to coordinate this change. We've asked the government to make a specific commitment to tackling vacant and derelict land, to eradicating vacant and derelict land over the long term. And that is so important. It's not going to happen without that sort of really strong government commitment. So that is the recommendations. What is it we think you can do? There's actually quite a lot, and I can't emphasize enough, you guys, or people like you, really do have so much power in this, because you're the ones with the expertise. You know what needs to happen. All we've provided is a platform to amplify your voice, and so you guys are really, really important to this. The first thing I would say is please do read the report. It's easy to say, but we've all got so much reading to do, and if anybody's anything like me, you never get round to it all. But there's so much detail in this that you simply won't get from Twitter, you won't get from listening to me rabbit on. So please do have a look, please do read it, and then please consider becoming an ambassador within your organisation. Agitate, endorse, make some noise, use your expertise to lobby those with the power, whether it's politicians or local leaders, to actually make that change that we're talking about. I think I've probably talked more than enough. I'll leave you there with a list of all the resources I've been talking about, all available on our website. Please do have a look, and tell us what you think. We'd love to hear from you.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Shona. I'm just going to stop the recording there.